Okay, what we see up here is we see the browser. It's returned some information from doing a status call on a status over here, but that doesn't mean that the browser is the only kind of client we can use. There are good reasons to use a browser as a client. It has lots of security features, but basically it's if you want to render stuff in HTML. Now, we may want to do other things with a different kind of client. In this case, I'm going to use a client called wget, and it's a command line client, but we can do the same sort of thing here. We can say wget 192.168.0.36:12138. And I have added a character 12138/status. And I'm giving it this parameter that's kind of like random called from. You'll notice that I've put single quote marks around it so that the shell does not do something with that question mark, which is a wild character in my shell. And I'm ready to run it. And when I get this, it's going to put its output in a file conveniently called status. So with wget, I really want to take the two files that it has and send those to something other than status. So let's use minus lowercase o, and this is one of the two output files. We'll call this demo1. And the other one is a minus capital O, and we'll call that demo. We'll call it demo1.out. And I don't remember which one is the errors and headers and which one is the actual output, but that way we get both files and we don't overwrite our local copy of anything called status, because I'm certain in this directory I don't have a demo1. All right, we run that. You'll notice that over here on the server, it printed out in its log format that you got status from my wget. And if I do cat to see what's in the file, you'll see that the first one of those, the one from the lowercase o, says that it got demo1 and it saved 118 bytes. That's the information right down here. And this is how long it took. And its status was okay, that it returned a code of 200. You'll notice that that matches with over here. We have 200 and 118 bytes transmitted, and that it put the output from this in demo1.out. And if I look at demo1.out, it surprisingly looks a lot like what we got up here in the browser. But guess what? We have it in a file. Now, if I want to be able to test my API, I probably don't want to use a browser to do testing, because browsers are really good at rendering HTML. What I want to do is I want to build some other kind of client that allows me to test my API. And getting the output into a file means that suddenly I can say, yeah, I can test this because I can stick it in a file and I can use other commands in the system to say, okay, is this file the same as what I got last time? Am I getting consistent results from this endpoint? Now, in our classwork, I've provided you with a partially complete testing program written in Python that does these, acts as a client, and it pulls stuff back and it pokes into the data to say, did you get stuff right? And it's not a real comprehensive test, but it is the piece that you would build along with the other stuff to test stuff and get it so that you have an automated test for an API. Another way of testing an API is actually just using the shell and using something like wget, or another client is called curl. You may have to install wget. Curl is probably already on your Linux system. But either way, use these clients to be able to pull back files, and then just keep reference copies of the files around, and use diff, which compares two files and tells you if the files are the same. But the combination of these things, you can build testing of your API. Let's look at how we're going to use parameters in other locations and build another piece of the server that does the insert of new issues. And, what we're going to do to test it and poke at it is we're going to use wget to actually poke into it as we're running it and see that we're getting the right results, that we're getting what we expect. Now, inside the code of the application, if we go back here to the application, another thing that you can do is I am going to bring up the I right-clicked on a Windows system, or I used Control-click on a Mac to bring up a thing called the inspector, which inspecting is looking at what the HTML is, but at the same time I get the opportunity to look at... This window is really narrow. We are going to change that right now so that I can get a little bit more space here. What I'm interested in is the console. And you'll notice that in the console, I've got printouts. Remember that over here, earlier when I brought up this page, it did get severity. And there is the call to get severity listed out in the console because it prints stuff out. And it has this object, and it said the severity was this set of data. I can poke into the data. It's got 6 or 7 entries in the data. And here's the severity and what the values are. And for that array of data, it says that it had an ID of 1 and a severity of unknown. I had an ID of 2, and it had a severity of minor. Now, if you look at the reference table data, this should look really familiar because here's the same reference table brought out to the browser where it can actually save it and use it. And it's telling you things like, here is the request that I made, and here's the stuff that I'm getting back. Another thing that it tells you in the browsers, if you click over here on network, and this is Chrome, Firefox is a little bit different. If I go over here and I do status, okay, the network one only shows what is happening after you bring up the network tab. But at that point, it tells you, here's where it made the request, how long it took, here's the status, or here's the request, which was /status, here's the status code that returned, here's the format and the library that did it, here's the 425 bytes that it returned. And if I click on that piece of information right there, it'll list the headers, okay, which is, here's the request, it did a get, it got a 200 status code response, here's the remote address on the server where it went to, and it has this strict origin when cross-origin policy that it's sending as a header from the browser. Now, wget does not send that, so it will do things that the browser will not, because the browser is saying, I am underneath this kind of a security policy called strict origin. The response, okay, is it actually said that it's allowing headers, and here's the headers that it will accept on the server. The control methods that it will accept is get, post, put, delete, and options. And it's allowing any origin. Now, this cross-origin stuff is probably going to be important to us later. I'll explain it. But here's the response. 92 bytes. It was application JSON format, when, and here's the server that you're using. You're using a WSGI server type in CPython 3.8.3. That should sound familiar. That's our version of Python. And here is the data that it returned. Here's a preview of the data. Okay. Broken down, status, database, okay, and the parameters. Here is the raw response of the data. This is what it looked like, which if you look over here, I'm printing it out. And there's other things in here, like did it have cookies? What's the timing? But you can actually poke into the network and what's going on. So here's our console and our network in the browser that allows us to go and see what's going on from the browser's perspective. Now, having this in the browser means that when we make requests from the browser and something goes wrong, we have the opportunity of looking in there and seeing, was the data right? Did the browser do the right thing? Did I make the correct request? But as soon as I look at the network tab, okay, and I go over here and I'm watching what request I make, okay, we go back to this, we look at our request, we can look through these things. As soon as I'm looking at that information, I can say, for that request, I can turn that request in the browser into something I can use in wget. And I can see if I'm getting the same response over here. So not only can we see it in the browser when it makes a request, we can see what requests it makes, what data it got back, and then say, over here in wget, I'm going to test with that particular piece of data multiple times and figure out how to use this other client, wget or curl, to be able to poke into my server and see what I'm getting back. Let's take a look at doing exactly that for the insert, and let's see how we're going to figure out what the browser does and what that insert is.